The night had fallen quietly over Knight Enterprises, a company that seemed to hum even in silence. The city skyline shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting silver reflections across the marble floor. Ava Collins pushed her service cart down the polished corridor of the executive level, her shoes whispering softly against the tiles. The scent of lemon cleaner filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of burnt coffee drifting from somewhere down the hall. It was nearly midnight, the hour when the office belonged to her and the ghosts of forgotten ambitions. The day's noise was gone. The phones were silent. Only the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic squeak of her cleaning tools kept her company. Ava liked it that way. She was invisible here, and invisibility was its own kind of safety. For 2 years, she had worked as part of the late-night maintenance crew, cleaning the offices that powered one of the city's largest tech empires. The others on her shift liked to gossip about the executives, who was dating who got fired, who drove what car, but Ava never joined in. She had learned to keep to herself. There was a certain peace in solitude, especially when the world had already taken so much from you. She would rather listen to the echo of her own thoughts than the chatter of people who didn't understand her silence. But every night, without fail, her steps slowed as she reached the glass door at the very end of the hallway, the one with the name Damian Knight, Chief Executive Officer, etched in bold silver letters across it. That door always made her heart skip, though she couldn't explain why. Everyone in the building knew of Damian Knight. To the public, he was the ruthless visionary who turned a near-bankrupt startup into an empire. To his employees, he was the man whose eyes could freeze water. He demanded perfection, expected loyalty, and offered nothing less than excellence in return. The rumors said he barely slept, that he trusted no one, and that his heart was buried beneath layers of logic and precision. Yet Ava had seen something different, something no one else seemed to notice. In the small, ordinary traces he left behind, the untouched meals, the scattered files, the late-night lights still glowing when everyone else had gone, she saw the loneliness of a man who had built walls too high for anyone to climb. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the handle. She knew he would be gone by now. He always was. But still she knocked softly out of habit before entering, as if asking permission to step into his world. The office was vast, glass, steel, and order. Yet tonight it wasn't empty. A low voice broke through the silence. "Come in." Ava froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had never heard his voice directed at her before, deep, calm, yet exhausted. When she finally gathered the courage to step inside, her eyes met the man behind the legend. Damian Knight sat behind a wide mahogany desk. His sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, a rare glimpse of humanity in a man known for his control. Papers covered the desk in chaotic piles, and beside them sat a cold cup of coffee and a sandwich still wrapped in plastic. He didn't look up immediately, his eyes scanning the lines of a document on the glowing laptop screen. "You can come back later," he said, his tone polite but detached. Ava's instinct told her to retreat, but something in his voice stopped her. Not authority, but fatigue. The kind of weariness that came from carrying too much for too long. "Of course, sir," she whispered, and yet she didn't move. Her eyes drifted toward the uneaten food, the dark circles under his eyes, and the faint tremor in his hands as he turned another page. Her heart ached quietly for a man who had everything and yet seemed to have nothing at all. "Sir, when did you last eat?" The words left her before she could stop them. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Damian lifted his gaze, his gray eyes sharp and analytical, as if assessing whether the question was an intrusion or an act of concern. "Excuse me?" His voice was softer now, surprised. Ava gestured awkwardly toward the sandwich. "That's been sitting there since morning, hasn't it?" He looked at it as if seeing it for the first time, then gave a small, humorless smile. "I suppose it has. Thank you, but I'm fine." His tone was final. But Ava saw the truth in the way his shoulders sagged and his focus wavered. "You'll be no good to anyone if you run yourself into the ground," she said quietly. Her voice held no authority, just simple sincerity. Before he could respond, she turned and left the room. In the break room, Ava stared at the vending machine for a long time before deciding to heat the sandwich in the microwave and brew a fresh cup of coffee. It wasn't much, but it was something. Her mother used to say that kindness was never wasted, even if it went unnoticed. When she returned, Damian was still buried in his work. She set the food in front of him without a word. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, breaking the sterile atmosphere of the room. He looked up, frowning slightly. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said simply. "But someone should." Then she left before her courage dissolved into embarrassment. That night, Damien Knight did something he hadn't done in months. He ate. Not because he needed the food, but because the gesture reminded him that he was still human. There had been something in her voice, a quiet steadiness free of pity or pretense. It stirred something long dormant inside him, something dangerously close to gratitude. From that night onward, their paths began to cross more often. It started with small exchanges, a polite greeting, a comment about the weather. But slowly those moments grew into quiet conversations that stretched into the early hours. Ava learned that Damien's empire had been built on loss. His parents had died when he was barely 20, leaving him with debt and a dream. He had clawed his way to success with determination sharper than steel, but at the cost of his peace. And now, with a corporate rival threatening to destroy everything he had built, he found himself alone again, fighting ghosts both past and present. Ava listened more than she spoke, offering little pieces of light when the darkness grew too heavy. Her words were simple, but they stayed with him long after she left. "Even the strongest machines need to stop to refuel," she had told him once, and he had laughed. A rare sound that filled the vast office with warmth. What Damien didn't know was that Ava's life was its own quiet storm. She worked 2 jobs to pay for her sister's medical treatment, attended night classes in education, and still found time to send money home to her widowed mother. Every day was a balancing act between exhaustion and hope, but she never complained. In Damien, she saw a reflection of her own struggle, the loneliness of those who carried others but were rarely carried themselves. She admired his strength, yes, but what truly drew her in was his humanity, the part of him that no one else seemed to see. Somewhere along the way, admiration became affection, and affection bloomed into something deeper, something unspoken. She knew her feelings were impossible. He was a man who moved through boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, while she lived paycheck to paycheck. But love doesn't ask for permission. It simply takes root quietly, stubbornly, in the spaces where hope still dares to exist. Then came the night that changed everything. Damien had been in his office for over 20 hours, reviewing a massive contract that could determine the fate of the company. His team assured him everything was perfect, but something in his gut said otherwise. When Ava arrived for her shift, she found him still there, his eyes red from fatigue. She hesitated before stepping closer. "You should rest," she said gently. "The numbers won't make sense if you can barely see straight." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "If I rest, this company might not wake up tomorrow." There was a heaviness in his tone that made Ava's chest tighten. She wanted to say something, to remind him that he wasn't alone in this fight, but instead she quietly placed a small sticky note on his desk before leaving for the night. On it she wrote, "Even storms run out of rain. Don't lose faith in the sun." The next morning, Damien found the note. He stared at it for a long time before slipping it into the top drawer of his desk. Something about those words struck a chord. Over the next few nights, more notes began appearing, small messages written in Ava's careful handwriting. "The darkest nights make the brightest stars. You're stronger than your fears. Keep going, someone believes in you." Each one was tucked somewhere new, under his keyboard, beside his pen holder near his coffee mug. He never asked who left them, though deep down he already knew. Weeks passed, and Damien began to rely on those words more than he cared to admit. They became a quiet lifeline, a reminder that there was still kindness in the world even when everything else seemed cruel. And then one morning he found a note that wasn't encouragement but warning. "Check the Whitman contract again. Something isn't right." Damien frowned. It was the deal his board had pushed aggressively, a merger that was supposed to save Knight Enterprises. Still, the note stirred his instincts. He reopened the files, combed through the clauses, and what he discovered made his blood run cold. Buried beneath the legal jargon was a hidden condition, one that would hand over his company's patent rights to a rival. It was a trap disguised as opportunity. Someone inside his trusted circle was betraying him. That night, Damien stayed behind, lights dimmed, waiting. He needed to know who was leaving those notes, the ones that saved him from disaster. At 11:30, he heard it. the soft creak of wheels and the quiet hum of a cleaning cart approaching. His pulse quickened. When the door opened, Ava froze under his gaze. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice softer than she'd ever heard him use, he said, "It was you, wasn't it?" She hesitated, eyes wide, the color draining from her face. "You've been the one leaving those notes." His tone wasn't angry. It was awed. Ava swallowed hard, searching for words. I just wanted to help. I noticed something strange in the reports when I was cleaning. I didn't mean to interfere. You saved this company," he interrupted quietly. "You saved me." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotion. Damien rose from his chair, moving around the desk until he stood before her. For the first time, Ava saw him not as the unshakable CEO, but as a man, vulnerable, grateful, and profoundly human. "Why would you do that?" he asked. Ava lowered her gaze. "Because everyone needs someone to believe in them, even people who seem like they don't." Her words hung in the air, soft but powerful. Damien exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "Ava Collins," he said at last, as if committing her name to memory. "For years I've been surrounded by people who wanted something from me. And tonight I realize you're the first person who gave me something without asking for anything in return." She didn't know how to respond. Her throat felt tight, her pulse loud in her ears. But in that moment something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but a deep recognition. Two souls who had lived too long in silence finally seeing each other in full. And though neither of them knew it then, that single night would be the beginning of everything. The unraveling of lies, the unveiling of truth, and the test of hearts that had never dared to hope before. For the first time in years, Damien Knight didn't go home that night. He sat in the quiet of his office, the city lights flickering beyond the glass like distant constellations, the weight of the evening pressing against his chest. Ava Collins. The name echoed softly in his thoughts. The woman he had passed countless times in the hallways without a second glance had turned out to be the one person who had truly seen him. Not the CEO, not the ruthless businessman, but the man who was slowly breaking beneath the pressure of his own success. It unsettled him. Not because he was ungrateful, but because it was rare for anyone to act out of pure kindness. In his world, every gesture came with a motive, every favor with an expectation. Yet she had done something extraordinary without wanting anything in return. It shook the foundation of the walls he had built around himself. The next evening, when Ava arrived for her shift, she tried to avoid his office altogether. Her heart still pounded when she thought about the way he had looked at her the night before. Not with anger, but with something far heavier. Gratitude mixed with curiosity. She feared she had overstepped, that she might lose her job for meddling in something that was never hers to touch. She told herself that her place was behind the mop, not in the orbit of a man who lived in the clouds of power and privilege. Yet as she moved past the corner office, a low voice stopped her. "Ava." Just hearing him say her name made her freeze mid-step. Slowly, she turned around. Damien was standing at the doorway, no longer hidden behind his desk, no longer the unreachable figure she had admired from afar. His tie was loosened, the first few buttons of his shirt undone, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp with intention. "Come in," he said softly. "Please." The word please caught her off guard. CEOs didn't ask, they commanded. But Damien Knight was not quite the same man she had seen before. When she stepped into the office, the first thing she noticed was that he had cleaned his desk. The clutter was gone, the empty coffee cups replaced with fresh flowers in a small glass vase. "You did this?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "No, I thought maybe I should make some space." "For clarity." His tone was distant, thoughtful. He gestured toward the seating area near the window, and she followed reluctantly. "I wanted to thank you properly," he began, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You didn't just save a contract. You saved 5,000 jobs, families, futures." Ava shook her head quickly. "I didn't do much. I just saw something that looked wrong." "You saw what none of my executives saw," he said firmly. "And that tells me something about how I've been leading. I've surrounded myself with people who tell me what I want to hear. You, on the other hand," his gaze softened, "you told me what I needed to know." Ava looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. The way he spoke made her feel exposed, seen in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. "I just didn't want to see you lose something you worked so hard for," she said after a moment. Sometimes the people who look unshakable are the ones closest to falling apart. Damien smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried the weight of years of restraint. You sound like someone who's learned that lesson firsthand. She didn't answer, but he saw the flicker in her eyes, that shadow of pain she tried so hard to hide. He didn't press. He knew too well what it meant to live with ghosts. Over the next few weeks, their conversations deepened. It started as gratitude, evolved into familiarity, and slowly grew into something more profound, a connection neither of them dared to name. Damien began staying late even when he didn't have to, not because of the work, but because he had started looking forward to the quiet hour when the world emptied out and Ava arrived. He found himself asking about her life, not out of curiosity but out of genuine interest. He learned that she had lost her father in an accident when she was 16, that her younger sister was battling a heart condition, and that every extra shift she worked went toward medical bills and tuition. She told him about her dreams of becoming a teacher someday, of building a life not defined by survival but by purpose. You're wasting your brilliance here, Damien told her one night, and she had laughed softly. Brilliance doesn't pay rent, Mr. Knight. Damien, he corrected gently. When it's just us, please call me Damien. She hesitated, her lips forming the word as if testing it for the first time. Damien, she repeated quietly. And somehow that single word, her voice saying his name, lingered in his mind long after she was gone. For Ava, those nights became something she both cherished and feared. She knew that what she felt was dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it was impossible. Men like Damien didn't fall for women like her, and yet, in his presence, she felt seen in a way she never had before. He never made her feel small. He listened when she spoke, remembered the little things she said, and looked at her as if she was more than the uniform she wore. He told her stories of his early days, how he slept in his office when he first started the company, how people laughed when he said he'd change the tech industry. There was passion in his words, but also pain, the kind that came from fighting too many battles alone. Ava listened quietly, her heart aching for the boy he once was, the one who had traded innocence for ambition. One evening, when the rain drummed softly against the windows, Damien surprised her with a simple gesture that made her breath catch. He handed her a folder, sleek, white, embossed with the Knight Enterprises logo. What's this? She asked. It's an application, he said. We have a scholarship program for employees who want to pursue higher education. It covers tuition and expenses. You qualify and you deserve it. Ava stared at the papers, her throat tightening. I can't accept this, she whispered. It's too much. It's not charity, Damien said calmly. It's an investment in someone who's already proven they have potential. She shook her head, overwhelmed. If people find out, they'll think you're giving me special treatment. He smiled faintly. Let them think whatever they want. I don't make decisions based on gossip. His words carried that quiet authority that made him who he was, a man who didn't bend to public opinion, only to truth. That night after she left, Ava walked through the rain with tears in her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, but of confusion, gratitude tangled with fear. For the first time, someone had believed in her without asking for proof. For years she had defined herself by limitations, by what she couldn't afford, couldn't change, couldn't reach. But Damien's belief in her cracked something open inside, something she had buried under exhaustion and self-doubt. She found herself daring to dream again, to imagine a life beyond survival. Meanwhile, Damien found himself changing in ways that startled him. The office that had once been a fortress of logic now carried warmth, a quiet hum of life that followed her presence. He caught himself watching the clock as the evening approached, feeling an unfamiliar anticipation. It terrified him. He was not a man who allowed feelings to interfere with control. Yet Ava had become the one variable he couldn't calculate. He found himself thinking about her laugh, her quiet strength, the way she carried the world's weight without letting it crush her spirit. He admired her resilience, not the kind forged by privilege, but the kind born of necessity and grace. But with that admiration came fear. Because deep down, Damien Knight knew the truth about himself, that every person he had ever cared for had eventually paid the price for being close to him. His success came with shadows, competitors who played dirty, board members who plotted in silence, journalists waiting for the smallest scandal to explode. He had made enemies in the climb to the top, and he couldn't bear the thought of Ava being hurt because of him. So, as his feelings grew stronger, he began to pull away, subtly, carefully, as if retreating from the edge of something too dangerous to touch. Ava noticed the change. The late-night talks grew shorter, the warmth in his eyes replaced by a distant professionalism. She told herself it was for the best, but her heart ached in ways she didn't know how to explain. Still, she continued leaving the small notes. Not out of hope, but out of habit. They had started as messages for him, but now they were reminders for herself. Keep believing. You've come too far to give up now. She didn't know that Damien kept every single one of them in a locked drawer, the same drawer that once held his company's most important contracts. Now it held pieces of the woman who had quietly rebuilt him from the inside out. Then, one morning, everything changed again. An anonymous email reached the company's board of directors, claiming that Damien Knight was in a personal entanglement with an employee, implying favoritism, manipulation, and unethical conduct. Attached to the message were photos, grainy but unmistakably showing Damien and Ava in his office, sitting close, sharing coffee, laughing together. To outsiders, it looked like intimacy. To those who wanted him gone, it was ammunition. Within hours, rumors spread like wildfire through the company. By afternoon, the board summoned Damien to an emergency meeting. When he saw the photos, his face hardened, but his heart sank. He knew exactly who would suffer most: Ava. She had done nothing wrong, yet she would be dragged into the storm. Without hesitation, Damien stood before the board and took the blame entirely upon himself. If my actions have caused misunderstanding, he said evenly, I will bear the consequences. But Miss Collins had no involvement beyond her duties. The board members exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others predatory. They had wanted a reason to weaken his hold on the company, and now they had one. By the end of the meeting, Damien was given an ultimatum. Take a temporary leave of absence while an internal review was conducted. The empire he had built was slipping from his hands, and the woman who had unknowingly saved him was now being targeted as the reason for his downfall. When Ava learned of the scandal, she was devastated. Whispers followed her everywhere she went, cruel, baseless, but loud enough to wound. People she had known for years suddenly looked at her with suspicion. Her supervisor suggested she take a break until things settled down. That night she went to Damien's office, her hands trembling, her eyes red from holding back tears. Why didn't you tell them the truth? She asked, her voice barely steady. Why didn't you clear my name? Damien looked at her with a weariness she had never seen before. Because they wouldn't have believed it, he said quietly. And because I can survive this. You can't. That's not fair, she whispered. None of this is. He nodded slowly. I know. But fairness doesn't exist in the world we live in. Only choices. He paused, his voice softening. And I would rather they destroy my reputation than touch yours. Ava felt her heart shatter. You can't protect me by destroying yourself. Damien smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed the storm within. Maybe not. But it's the only way I know how to love someone. Her breath caught at his words, but before she could speak, he turned away, his silhouette framed against the city lights. A man who had everything, willing to lose it all for something he couldn't keep. That night marked the end of everything they had known. But as with all endings, it was also the beginning of something neither could yet understand. The slow, painful journey from ruin to redemption, from silence to truth, from fear to freedom. The days following Damien Knight's suspension felt like a slow unraveling of the life he had spent more than a decade building. Knight Enterprises no longer pulsed with the same sense of certainty. The halls once filled with the rhythm of innovation now echoed with whispers and speculation. The glass walls that had symbolized transparency now felt like cages, trapping rumors inside for everyone to see. Damien had agreed to step down temporarily, officially for the sake of an internal ethics review, though he knew the board had seized the chance to weaken him. What he hadn't expected was the emptiness that followed once his access card was disabled, his name removed from the daily reports, and his calendar cleared of purpose. He had lived inside those walls for so long that stepping outside them felt like being stripped of identity. The city that glittered beyond his penthouse window looked the same, yet somehow crueler. as though mocking the man who had once believed he could outwork destiny itself. In the quiet of his exile, Damien found himself thinking of Ava more often than he wanted to admit. He imagined her walking down those same hallways, head bowed, enduring the judgmental stares of people who had never bothered to know her story. He had thought taking the blame would shield her, but rumors had a way of clawing through truth. Every gossip column, every whisper among employees carried her name now. He hated himself for not foreseeing that protecting her would only make her more visible, yet even in self-reproach he admired her courage. She hadn't contacted him, though she easily could have. She hadn't defended herself publicly or sought pity. She simply continued to work, to study, to exist with quiet dignity. That silence spoke louder than any press release ever could. Ava, meanwhile, was living through days that blurred into one another, heavy with exhaustion and the ache of unspoken words. The job she had once cherished felt hostile now. Colleagues who had once exchanged small smiles during late shifts avoided her eyes. The company's HR department had temporarily reassigned her to another floor, an act of subtle punishment disguised as procedure. She spent her breaks in the small staff lounge instead of the rooftop garden she used to clean, afraid of being seen as an intruder in a world that now treated her like a rumor. But even amid humiliation, she refused to let bitterness consume her. She told herself that people believed what they needed to believe, to fill the emptiness of their own lives. If she kept walking with her head high, maybe the storm would pass. Her mother's words echoed in her mind on the nights she wanted to give up. When life closes its doors, build your own doorway. You can't wait for permission to stand tall. And so she kept building in small, quiet ways. She applied for community teaching programs, volunteered at a literacy center on weekends, and spent long hours in the library studying lesson plans. The scholarship Damien had urged her to apply for still sat in her drawer, unsigned, but she read it often. Not for the opportunity it promised, but for the handwritten note he had slipped inside the folder. You once reminded me that even the strongest machines need fuel. Let this be yours. You owe no one an apology for your brilliance. She didn't know when he had written it, but she carried those words in her heart like armor. Meanwhile, Damien's absence began to reshape the company in ways both subtle and catastrophic. The acting interim CEO, a board member named Graham Ellis, wasted no time implementing sweeping changes, layoffs masked as restructuring, budget cuts disguised as efficiency measures. Projects that had once prioritized innovation were shelved in favor of quick profits. Knight Enterprises, the company Damien had envisioned as a beacon of purpose, was transforming into something cold and mechanical. From the outside, the numbers looked promising. Internally, morale was collapsing. Employees who had once thrived under Damien's demanding yet inspiring leadership now worked in fear. It was ironic. The same man critics had labeled ruthless had actually been the one keeping the company humane. Damien watched from a distance, helpless. His advisors told him to stay quiet until the review concluded, but silence had never been his nature. Nights stretched endlessly in his penthouse, sterile, immaculate, and utterly devoid of meaning. He spent hours reading through past correspondence, notes from former employees, plans he had drafted but never launched. And somewhere in that solitude he began to see what Ava had seen all along, that he had built an empire too focused on control and not enough on connection. He had believed perfection was protection, that emotion was weakness, but now the absence of both was suffocating him. He thought of her sticky notes, those small bursts of faith she had left on his desk, each one a seed of hope planted in the soil of his fatigue. He found himself rereading them, letting the inked words remind him that his value didn't end with a title. The realization was humbling, that it had taken losing everything to understand that leadership wasn't about power, but about presence. One rainy evening, unable to bear the inertia any longer, Damien ventured out into the city for the first time since his suspension. He walked without destination, coat collar turned up, blending into the anonymous crowd. The neon signs blurred in the drizzle, and the smell of roasted coffee drifted from a small cafe tucked between office towers. He hesitated, then stepped inside, drawn by warmth more than curiosity. As he waited for his order, a voice called his name, uncertain, tentative. Mr. Knight? He turned and saw a young man who had once interned at his company, now seated with a laptop and a half-empty mug. The man's face lit with genuine respect. "I didn't expect to see you here. Everyone says you vanished." Damien smiled faintly. "Something like that." The intern lowered his voice. "People miss you. It's not the same without you there. Ellis is cutting corners and projects are collapsing. I know you probably don't want to hear about it, but I thought you should know." Damien nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. That brief encounter reignited something inside him, not pride, but purpose. He realized that retreating hadn't protected anyone. It had only allowed injustice to spread unchecked. The next morning, Damien began to act. Though officially barred from company matters, he still had contacts, journalists who respected him, investors who trusted his judgment, and most importantly, employees who still believed in his vision. Quietly, he started gathering information about the internal restructuring, compiling evidence of mismanagement under Ellis. He worked from his home office like a man possessed, driven not by revenge but by responsibility. For years, his ambition had been self-centered, focused on legacy. Now it was fueled by redemption. He wanted to prove that truth, once buried, could still rise. Ava learned of his quiet efforts indirectly. One evening, as she left the building, an older manager named Mrs. Green, one of the few who treated her kindly, stopped her in the lobby. "You should know," she whispered. "Mr. Knight hasn't given up. He's trying to fix what went wrong. Don't lose hope." Ava thanked her softly, though her eyes filled with tears. She hadn't expected anything less from him. Deep down, she knew Damien wasn't the kind of man to surrender. Yet she also knew the cost of standing against people with power, the loneliness, the ridicule, the exhaustion. She wanted to help him somehow, but the distance between their worlds still felt enormous. Then fate, as it often does, found a way to close that distance. One afternoon, while sorting documents in a disused storage room, Ava stumbled upon a folder labeled Project Lucent, Confidential. The name meant nothing to her at first, but as she flipped through the pages, recognition struck. It was an early version of the same proposal that had led to Damien's suspension, except this draft contained timestamps and signatures that directly contradicted the board's public narrative. It proved that the incriminating photos and reports had been orchestrated by Ellis and a rival company's consultant to force Damien out. Her hands trembled as she realized the gravity of what she held. She could clear his name, but doing so meant stepping into the very spotlight she had tried to avoid. For a long moment she just stood there, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing above, the paper cold against her skin. Then she remembered the way Damien had once looked at her and said, "Everyone contributes. Everyone matters." For the first time, she truly believed it. That night, Ava sent an anonymous message to Damien's private email address, one she had found by chance months ago when cleaning his office. "I found something that can help you. Meet me tomorrow 9 p.m. at the old library near Riverside." She hesitated before adding, "It's time truth spoke louder than whispers." Damien read the message twice, recognizing the rhythm of her words instantly. A strange calm settled over him. For weeks he had been collecting fragments of proof, but none as solid as this. Still, the thought of involving Ava again filled him with dread. She had suffered enough because of him. Yet he also knew her well enough now to understand that trying to stop her would only push her further. And so the next evening, as the city sank into twilight, he walked toward the abandoned library that once housed Knight Enterprises' earliest brainstorming sessions. A poetic choice, he thought, for a new beginning. The building smelled of dust and memory. Moonlight filtered through broken panes, illuminating shelves that had long forgotten the weight of books. Ava was already there, clutching the folder tightly, her expression steady but her pulse visible at her throat. For a moment they simply looked at each other, two people bound by silence and sacrifice. Damien was the first to speak. "You shouldn't have come. And you shouldn't have fallen alone," she replied softly. She handed him the folder. "This proves Ellis set you up. The timestamps, the email trails, everything. I found it by accident, but I think fate wanted me to." He flipped through the pages, his analytical mind processing every line. When he looked up, his eyes held something between awe and gratitude. "You just saved an empire again," he murmured. "No," she corrected gently. "You saved yourself. I only reminded you where the truth was hiding." For the first time in months, Damien laughed, a low, genuine sound that seemed to warm the cold air. It wasn't the laughter of a powerful man reclaiming victory, but of a weary soul rediscovering life. Ava, he said after a long pause. When this is over, you won't have to hide in the shadows anymore. You deserve better than this world has given you. She smiled faintly. Maybe. But shadows aren't so bad when they teach you how to find your own light. He wanted to tell her what she truly meant to him, how her courage had reshaped his understanding of strength. But he knew this wasn't the moment for confessions. The truth they carried was too heavy, too dangerous. What mattered now was restoration. Over the next weeks, they worked together in secret, discreetly compiling documents, forwarding encrypted files to trustworthy journalists, and preparing a presentation for the shareholders' meeting. It was a partnership built on trust, quiet communication, and shared purpose. The distance that society placed between their positions no longer mattered. They were simply two souls fighting for integrity in a world addicted to appearances. And somewhere in the middle of late-night exchanges and stolen hours, they discovered a peace neither had known before. Their conversations no longer needed words. Sometimes a glance was enough, a mutual understanding that truth itself was the most intimate connection of all. By the time the day of the shareholders' meeting arrived, the evidence was irrefutable. Damien walked into the grand conference hall not as the disgraced executive the media portrayed, but as a man reborn. The presentation unfolded with calm precision, documents displayed on screens, timelines laid bare, motives exposed. The room grew silent as Ellis's scheme unraveled before their eyes. When it was over, there was no applause, only the heavy collective awareness of justice returning to its rightful place. The board voted unanimously to reinstate Damien Knight as CEO of Knight Enterprises. Yet even as cameras flashed and journalists swarmed, his thoughts were elsewhere. With the woman standing quietly at the back of the room, her expression unreadable, her eyes shining not with triumph but with quiet relief. After the chaos subsided, Damien found her near the elevator lobby. "It's over," he said softly. "You did it." "We did it," she corrected. There was a long silence, heavy with everything left unsaid. Finally, she looked at him with that steady calm he had come to rely on. "Now that you have your world back, make sure you build it differently." He nodded. "I will, and this time it will be built on truth," she smiled, then turned to leave, her figure disappearing into the crowd of employees now whispering his name with renewed respect. As Damien watched her go, he realized something profound, that sometimes the greatest loves are not the ones declared with grand gestures, but the ones lived through quiet loyalty and shared purpose. Ava had walked into his life as a shadow, yet she had become the light that guided him back to himself. And though their paths were diverging once more, he knew this wasn't the end. It was simply the pause before destiny called them together again. In a world they both would rebuild, not through power, but through compassion. The morning after the shareholders' meeting dawned with a rare softness. The city skyline shimmered beneath a pale gold sunrise, as if the universe itself had decided to cleanse the lingering tension of the storm that had consumed Knight Enterprises. For the first time in what felt like years, Damien Knight stood by his penthouse window not as a man burdened by ambition or guilt, but as someone on the edge of renewal. The reinstatement had been swift, decisive, and widely publicized, yet beneath the applause and flashing cameras, Damien felt something deeper stir inside him, a sense of clarity that he had never allowed himself to experience before. The company was his again, yes, but the victory no longer tasted of dominance or pride. Instead, it tasted of redemption, the quiet, unglamorous kind that demanded humility and patience. When he walked into the headquarters that morning, the atmosphere was tense with a mix of anticipation and guilt. The same employees who had once whispered behind his back now stood straighter, offering tentative smiles as if unsure whether forgiveness could exist in such corporate corridors. Damien, however, carried no bitterness. He greeted each person with calm composure, his tone steady, his eyes kind. People had expected the old Damien, sharp, impatient, untouchable, but what they saw instead was a man softened by experience. He addressed the entire staff in the main auditorium later that day, standing under the glowing insignia of Knight Enterprises. His speech wasn't rehearsed or strategic. It was human. "I built this company to represent excellence," he began, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "But somewhere along the way, I confused excellence with perfection. I thought the only way to lead was to be unyielding, to demand, to control, to protect the vision at any cost. I was wrong. Leadership isn't about being untouchable. It's about being accountable. It's about trusting in each other and in the truth. We fell because I built walls instead of bridges, but now we rebuild not to reclaim what was lost, but to create something better. There was no grand applause when he finished, only a long, thoughtful silence. Then slowly the room filled with quiet claps, the kind that came from genuine emotion rather than obligation. People began to rise one after another until the entire auditorium stood in quiet unity. Damien smiled faintly, not in pride but in gratitude. The company was breathing again, not because of him but with him. Yet even as Knight Enterprises began its rebirth, there was a space within Damien that remained unfulfilled. Ava Collins had not returned to the building since the day of the meeting. He had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that she would. He missed the subtle warmth of her presence, not the romanticized kind of longing, but something gentler, rarer. Ava had become the quiet constant in the noise of his life, and without her even triumph felt strangely hollow. Still, he respected her silence. She had done her part, and perhaps she needed space to find herself beyond the shadow of his name. In the weeks that followed, Ava poured her energy into rebuilding her own life. The scholarship offer she had once tucked away in hesitation now became her gateway to transformation. She accepted it, not as a favor from Damien Knight, but as a gift from fate, a sign that she was meant for something beyond cleaning offices and fixing other people's chaos. The scholarship took her into a program for community education and leadership, and within that environment, Ava began to rediscover her voice. Her professors noticed the depth in her reflections, the quiet authority in her words. She wasn't loud, but when she spoke, people listened, not because her tone demanded attention, but because her truth resonated. She rented a small apartment near the campus, modest but filled with light. Every morning as she opened her curtains, she thought about how different her world had become. There was peace now, a kind she had never allowed herself to believe she could have. And yet sometimes when she stayed up late working on lesson plans or reading case studies, her mind drifted back to Damien, to the night at the library, the quiet tension between them, the way his eyes had softened when she handed him the folder that changed everything. She wondered how he was rebuilding, whether he was still the same or had changed in the way she had hoped he would. But she didn't reach out. Love, she had learned, wasn't always about being near. Sometimes it was about trusting the distance to teach both hearts what they needed to learn alone. Back at Knight Enterprises, Damien was reshaping everything from the ground up. Gone were the sterile hierarchies and mechanical efficiency. He created a new department dedicated to ethical innovation, gave employees more say in projects, and introduced mentorship programs for underrepresented workers. He wanted the company to become a place where dreams didn't have to die at the feet of power. It wasn't easy. Change never was. But each small victory, a new initiative, a grateful employee, a letter from a family whose livelihood was restored, reminded him that this was the real legacy worth building. Late one night, as he reviewed reports in his now simpler office, he found himself pausing by the drawer where he had kept Ava's notes. They were still there, slightly crumpled, faintly yellowed, but alive with her handwriting. He read them again, each line carrying echoes of her belief in him. For a man who once measured value in profit margins, it was humbling to realize that his greatest asset had been faith. Hers, not his. Months passed, and the company's transformation drew attention. Media outlets that once vilified Damien now praised his leadership renaissance. But Damien no longer chased headlines. He had learned that real success wasn't about being seen. It was about being remembered for the right reasons. One evening, he was invited to speak at a national forum on ethical business practices, a platform that would have once fed his ego, but now only served as an opportunity to share what he had learned. As he stepped onto the stage and began his speech, he found himself mentioning her without even planning to. There was someone, he said, who reminded me that leadership isn't about perfection, it's about compassion, that every empire, no matter how grand, begins to crumble the moment it forgets the people it was built for. His voice softened. I owe much of who I am today to that reminder. The audience applauded, unaware of the full story behind his words, but Damien knew they didn't need to. Some stories were meant to remain sacred between the hearts that lived them. Elsewhere, in her modest apartment, Ava watched the same speech on her laptop. She hadn't expected to feel the emotion that surged through her when she heard those words. The quiet acknowledgement that wasn't about credit, but about connection. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the strange, full peace of knowing that something beautiful had come from all the pain they had endured. She whispered softly to herself, "You did it, Damien," then closed the laptop with a smile that carried both pride and closure. But fate, ever unpredictable, had another turn to offer. A few weeks later, Ava was invited to a charity gala hosted by the Education Advancement Foundation, an event designed to connect graduates with leaders from various industries. She almost declined, thinking it wasn't her kind of environment, but one of her professors insisted. "You need to be there," he said. "There will be people who can help you expand your community project." Reluctantly, she agreed. The night of the event, she wore a simple pale blue dress, her hair tied back neatly. She had never felt comfortable in formal gatherings, yet there was an unshakable calm in her as she stepped into the grand ballroom. She moved through the crowd gracefully, speaking with educators and donors, unaware that across the room, a pair of familiar eyes had already found her. Damien had been invited to the same event as a keynote guest, representing corporate sponsorship for educational initiatives. He had just finished his short address when his gaze swept the room, and then stopped. For a moment, he wondered if exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But no, it was her, Ava Collins, standing under the warm lights, surrounded by people who seemed drawn to her quiet grace. She looked exactly as he remembered, except now there was a new kind of confidence in her, a gentle assurance that radiated from within. He watched her speak to a small group, smiling, her hands moving slightly as she explained something with passion. There was no trace of the timid employee who once avoided the spotlight. She was blooming, completely and beautifully, and for the first time Damien felt content just watching from afar. Eventually, though, fate closed the distance once more. As the evening wound down, they crossed paths near the exit. Ava turned, and their eyes met. For a long, suspended moment, time seemed to still. The noise of the gala faded, replaced by a silence heavy with recognition and gratitude. Damien spoke first, his voice low but steady. "I didn't expect to see you here." Ava smiled gently. "I could say the same. It seems we keep meeting where new beginnings happen." He laughed softly. "Maybe that's what we do, find light in broken places." They talked for a while, not about the past, not about what was lost or almost found, but about the journeys they had taken since. She told him about her teaching program, about the literacy centers she wanted to open for underprivileged youth. He told her about his foundation initiatives, how he was trying to use corporate influence to fund real education reform. As they spoke, Damien realized that what bound them together was no longer pain or regret, but shared purpose. They had both transformed their scars into blueprints for something larger than themselves. When the night finally came to a close, Damien walked her to the steps outside the hall. The city stretched before them, alive, luminous, eternal. For a moment, they simply stood there, letting the cool wind carry the silence that no longer felt awkward but comforting. "You once told me," Ava said quietly, "that everyone matters. I think you finally proved yourself right." Damien smiled, his gaze steady on hers. "And you once told me that shadows teach you how to find light. You were right too." She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "Maybe we both needed to fall apart to learn how to stand together, when even if we're standing in different worlds." He wanted to say something, to tell her that the world felt less like a battlefield and more like home when she was near, but he knew this wasn't the moment for grand confessions. Some connections didn't need defining. They just needed to be honored. So he simply nodded and said, "Keep shining, Ava. The world needs your kind of light." She smiled, her eyes glistening under the city glow. "And you, Damien, keep building a world where people don't have to hide their hearts." With that, she turned and walked away, her silhouette merging with the pulse of the city, leaving Damien standing under the soft amber lights of the street, his heart full not with longing, but with peace. That night, as he drove home, Damien realized something profound. Love wasn't always a story of possession or promises. Sometimes it was about witnessing someone's evolution and knowing you had been a part of their becoming. Ava had taught him that silence could speak volumes, that kindness could rebuild empires, and that redemption wasn't found in grand gestures, but in the quiet courage to begin again. And as the city lights reflected across his windshield, Damien Knight, the once iron-hearted CEO, smiled to himself, finally understanding that the greatest success in life wasn't measured in achievements or wealth, but in the souls you help set free. Years passed, quietly but with purpose, like the gentle unfolding of a dawn no one expected. Time had a strange way of softening the sharp edges of memory, polishing pain into wisdom and turning distance into perspective. The world that had once revolved around ambition and survival, for both Damien Knight and Ava Collins, had grown wider, gentler, more meaningful. They had not seen each other since that night outside the gala, yet neither had truly left the other's life. Their paths diverged, but the lessons they had exchanged continued to ripple through everything they touched, invisible threads connecting their worlds, guiding their choices even when they walked alone. For Damien, the years that followed were not about expansion or dominance. They were about transformation. Knight Enterprises evolved from a symbol of corporate power into a movement of ethical influence. He restructured entire departments to focus on sustainable development, education access, and mental wellness in the workplace. He implemented transparent policies, created wellness initiatives, and began sponsoring innovation programs for underprivileged students who dreamed of entering the tech world. The same board that had once doubted him now admired him, though Damien himself had long ceased caring about admiration. What mattered now was impact, the kind that left real change behind. He became a man of quiet integrity, the kind whose leadership didn't roar but resonated. He no longer spoke from behind podiums but from classrooms, visiting schools and community centers, standing among children who reminded him of what dreams looked like before the world complicated them. When journalists asked him about his transformation, he never mentioned the scandals or the trials. Instead, he would say, "At some point, I stopped chasing success and started listening to it." Sometimes the voice of success isn't loud. Sometimes it whispers through the people who remind you who you are. Those who knew him well understood that this was his way of honoring the woman who had changed. Him, the one he never named but never forgot. Ava's life, meanwhile, had blossomed in ways that once seemed impossible. The scholarship she once hesitated to accept became the cornerstone of a journey that reshaped her destiny. She completed her degree with distinction and began working as a teacher in a community school where most of her students came from broken homes and limited means. But she didn't just teach subjects. She taught belief, the belief that no one's circumstances had the right to define their ceiling. Her classroom walls were filled with color, her students' drawings taped beside quotes that she wrote each morning. You matter. Every day is a new beginning. The world needs your voice. Her students loved her not because she was the best teacher they had ever had, but because she made them feel seen, something she herself had once longed for in the quiet halls of a skyscraper where she was invisible. But Ava didn't stop there. In her spare time, she began organizing small literacy programs for adults who had never completed school. What started as evening workshops in a single neighborhood soon expanded into a full-fledged community foundation called the Collins Project. It was funded largely by small donations and volunteers, but one day, when she least expected it, she received a letter, typed neatly on Knight Enterprises stationery. The message was brief, formal, yet unmistakably personal. Your work reflects the kind of world we always hope to build. Consider this a partnership, not a donation. Keep lighting the way. DK. The check enclosed was generous enough to secure 3 new learning centers. Ava smiled when she read it. She didn't need his signature to know it came from him. Damien had always had a way of giving without taking credit, of stepping back to let others shine. It was his way of loving from a distance, quietly, selflessly, steadfastly. And so, both continued their separate missions. 2 lives running parallel, intersecting not through proximity but through purpose. Yet destiny, ever patient, had one more meeting written into their story. It was nearly 7 years after their last encounter when Ava received an invitation that carried the weight of memory. It was from Knight Enterprises, now hosting a global summit on ethical leadership and education technology. The summit was designed to bring together innovators, teachers, and business leaders working toward social advancement. The invitation was personal. Damian Knight himself requested that Ava Collins deliver the keynote address on education reform and its human impact. For a long moment, she simply stared at the letter. Her heart, though calm, trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of reverence for how far they had both come. After everything, their stories were crossing again, not as the employer and the employee, not as two souls bound by unspoken feelings, but as equals walking the same higher path. When the day of the summit arrived, the city was radiant with early spring sunlight. The glass towers sparkled like they had been polished with hope itself. Ava stood backstage, her notes in hand, her reflection caught in the mirror, older, wiser, but still carrying that same quiet fire in her eyes. She wore a simple ivory suit, elegant and understated, the kind of grace that did not demand attention but effortlessly held it. Her pulse quickened as she heard Damian's voice echo from the main hall, steady, measured yet warmer than she remembered. He was introducing her. Today, he said to the gathered audience of world leaders, educators and innovators, we speak of progress, not the kind built by machines or markets, but the kind built by hearts and minds that refuse to give up on humanity. Our next speaker embodies that spirit. Years ago, when I was lost in the noise of ambition, someone reminded me of something I had forgotten, that leadership is not about power, but about people. She turned belief into change, and her work continues to transform lives every day. Please welcome Ava Collins. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Damian didn't see the crowd. His eyes were fixed only on her as she stepped onto the stage, her calm presence filling the room with an almost sacred energy. When their gazes met across the stage, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. A thank you, a recognition, a closure wrapped inside a beginning. Ava began to speak, her voice gentle yet strong, carrying the rhythm of conviction. She talked about education not as a system, but as a heartbeat, the pulse that sustained communities, the bridge that turned despair into possibility. She spoke of the children who once feared their voices didn't matter, and how she watched them blossom when given belief instead of pity. We build the future, she said, not by creating perfect systems, but by nurturing imperfect people until they realize their own strength. That is the essence of change, and that is the kind of world I want to see. Her words silenced the hall, not out of awe, but out of collective reflection. When she finished, the applause that followed wasn't just for her, it was for everything she represented. Resilience, faith, rebirth. After the ceremony, as the evening lights bathed the city in gold, Damian found her standing alone on the balcony overlooking the skyline. The years had softened him too, his expression no longer guarded, his demeanor no longer sharp-edged. He approached quietly, his footsteps light on the marble. When she turned and saw him, she smiled, not with surprise, but with the warmth of someone who had expected this reunion, as if the universe had orchestrated it perfectly. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, no words needed. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of understanding, gratitude, and peace. You've built something extraordinary, he said finally, his voice low and sincere. You've built something that changes lives every single day. Ava smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. So have you, Damian. You turned an empire into a legacy. You made your power mean something. He chuckled softly. Maybe we both learned from the same lesson, that success without purpose is just noise. And love without growth, she added quietly, is just attachment. They both smiled at that, the truth of it settling between them like a shared secret. Damian leaned against the railing, watching the city lights flicker like constellations reflected on glass. There was a time, he said slowly, when I thought I had lost everything that mattered. The company, my reputation, my sense of control. But losing those things was the only way I could find myself again. You were the first person who showed me that I was more than what I built. For that, I'll always be grateful. Ava's eyes softened. You found your own light, Damian. I just held the mirror. For a long while, they stood together in silence, not as two souls bound by longing, but as two lives that had completed each other's unfinished lessons. There was no need for declarations or promises. Their story had already said everything it needed to. Finally, as the evening breeze brushed through her hair, Ava turned to him one last time. You know, she said, When I used to clean your office at night, I would leave little notes on your desk. Words of hope, reminders to keep going. Back then I didn't know if you ever read them." Damien smiled, his eyes reflecting a quiet ache of nostalgia. "I kept every single one," he said softly. "They're still in my desk. Some nights I read them again. Not because I need the reminders, but because they remind me where I began." Ava's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the light of closure. "Then maybe that's all any of us ever need. A reminder of where we began so we never forget how far we've come." Damien nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were my reminder, Ava. You always will be." The city stretched before them, vast, alive, endless. The same city that had once witnessed their struggles, their silence, their rebirth. Somewhere below, in the rhythm of its streets, children laughed, dreams stirred, and lives changed because two people had dared to believe that compassion could rewrite destiny. Ava and Damien stood side by side, their hands brushing briefly, a touch that held no possession, only understanding. Then, as the night deepened and the stars began to appear, they parted ways once more, not in sadness but in peace, two souls walking into different directions of the same purpose. Years later, when historians wrote about the rise of ethical innovation and the educational renaissance that reshaped the city, they often mentioned two names: Damien Knight, the visionary who redefined leadership, and Ava Collins, the teacher who redefined hope. Few knew the story behind those names. Fewer still understood the silent love that had fueled their transformation. But those who did say that if you stood atop the Knight Foundation's headquarters at night, you could still feel it, that quiet pulse of faith, kindness and redemption echoing through the glass walls, whispering the same words Ava once left on his desk. The darkest nights produce the brightest stars. And that, at last, was their legacy, not a love story lost, but a world rebuilt from silence,